Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, the Sculptural Imagination. My name is David Bell, and I'm the University Curator at Loughborough University. And tonight's event is the first event as part of what we're sort of calling our Sculpture Week at Loughborough University. So we've got a few events over the course of the week, a couple more on Wednesday, and we've launched an exhibition in the University Library today. Some photographs of our sculpture collection, so if you're around Loughborough, do have a look at that. And tonight's event really kicks us off, and it's an event I'm really excited to be introducing, to be chairing. And I'll say a little bit more about where the impetus for tonight's event comes shortly, before we kind of launch into it. And then also, before I do that, I'll just say a little bit about the structure of the event in terms of timings and how we're going to organise things. So there'll be a talk from Richard Johnson, who I'll introduce properly before he gives his talk, talking about this wonderful book that he's produced, Our Tower, which features, he's the illustrator of this book, which is authored by Joseph Coelho, the Children's Laureate. And as Richard will explain, the illustrations include drawings of and inspired by The Watchers by Lynn Chadwick, one of the sculptures that's in our collection. And following that, I'll be in conversation with Kate and Charlie from NEUSCHLOSS, who are an artist collective based at Northumbria University, who've been doing some work with our sculpture collection for quite a while now, and they've produced Cleaved Into, which I also have to hand, this really lovely activity pack, as they've called it, which features a series of kind of creative responses to the sculpture collection and some prompts inviting you to produce your own creative responses. I'm delighted to say that we do have copies of these available free of charge. So if you would like one, please, I'll let you know at the end of the event how you can procure one, and we're happy to get them out to you. So obviously the event is taking place on Zoom. We are recording it, and the recording will be uploaded to YouTube following the event. So if you want to watch it back, that will be there for you to watch. I'm going to talk until maybe for about 10 minutes at max, just to introduce the collection and the impetus for tonight's event. Richard's then going to talk. It's an illustrated talk, so he's going to share some drawings from Our Tower and some of his other illustrative work. And he'll talk from about 6:45 until just after 7, around 20 minutes. And then I'll host Charlie and Kate from NEUSCHLOSS, again for around 20 minutes in conversation. We've got a little bit of flexibility with the time. We'll then take a short break, just a comfort break for people to step away from the screen. And then at the end, there'll be time for audience questions and participation. So if you've got questions, comments, you're very welcome to share those at the end. You can share them either by raising your hand through the Zoom raise hand function, and then I'll invite you to unmute yourself. You can put your camera on if you wish, and you can speak your question or comment. You're equally welcome to type them into the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat and read them out. And if you want to submit a question anonymously, you can select in the chat just to send it to me, and I can read it out anonymously. If you have any questions at any point during the event, feel free, again, just use the chat function, select me, David Bell, from the drop-down list and ping me a question, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. Hopefully that's all clear, but if anyone's got any questions, do feel free to pop them in the chat now. So, where did the impetus for tonight's event come from? Just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, so Loughborough University has quite a large and I think quite an interesting sculpture collection, which obviously forms part of a broader arts collection. So you can find out information about works in the collection on this webpage. So if you type in LU Arts or Loughborough University Sculpture, this list here that I'm scrolling through doesn't have every work in our collection in it, but it has a lot of the most significant works. We do also have this Google map, so if you click on that, this brings up a map which, if you've got Google Maps on your phone, enables you to walk the collection. And this contains every sculpture that is publicly accessible on our campus on it. These are the purple markers represent the sculptures. So they're spread out over a couple of miles, really, from starting at the east end of campus up here, right down to the sort of science park end of campus here, which is a mystery to a lot of people because a lot of students and staff would never venture there. The purple dots represent individual sculptures, and if you click on them, that's actually a rose, which is a sort of sculptural work. I won't introduce that now, but do have a look if you're interested. So yeah, each dot represents a sculpture, and you get a photograph and a little bit of information about the sculpture, and there's a suggested route as well. The gold dots relate to another artwork called Fruit Roots, which is a sort of living artwork installed across part of our campus, a series of orchards connected by edible trees, nuts, etc. So to give a little bit of background to the collection, there's not a single coherent collection in a sense. The works we have are at Loughborough University for a variety of reasons. And prominent among these is the work of Stuart Mason, who was the Director of Education for Leicestershire from 1947 to 1971. And he was very much a man of his time in a sense, kind of typical social democratic, paternalist, kind of post-war educational figure. And he really quite strongly believed that educational establishments should be populated with, I guess, gently experimental works of art. So kind of, he was really opposed, for example, to pictures of the Queen. And this applied to all educational establishments that fell under the rubric of the council, which at the time included what was first the three precursor colleges to Loughborough University, and then from 1966 onwards, what became Loughborough University of Technology, as it was then. So unlike other universities, it fell under the remit of the local council, or the county council rather. So Mason would commission and purchase works, not just sculpture, prints and paintings as well, for the colleges and the university. When a new building was being built, he would put some of the funds aside to commission work or have work installed on the building itself, and he purchased works. And he worked with leading gallerists of the day to select artists. And although some schools around Loughborough have works by Hepworth and Moore, generally speaking, the artist was sort of, I guess, on the next kind of rung down, younger, up-and-coming artists. And an exemplary of these, and perhaps, well, certainly the most famous and well-known in our collection, is Lynn Chadwick, who's The Watchers is on screen now. And this is obviously a work that comes up in Richard's book, and I think that Kate and Charlie will talk about as well. So we have a number of these works in our collection. Sorry, I just need to move my screen around so I can access the next tab. So this is another work from that period, Willie Sukop's The Spirit of Adventure, more modest in scale, but again, I think still kind of exemplifying that sort of gentle experimentalism of the time in that kind of gently avant-garde sculptural form. But our sculpture collection doesn't entirely date from that period, and it isn't entirely outdoor work either. So this is a recent work by a student. So we have a few student sculptures in our collection. This is a much smaller scale indoor work by Georgie Gerard, who is actually a textiles student who graduated last year. We purchased this work from the degree show. And as you might be able to see from the sign there, its form is inspired by Durdle Door, the cliff face in Dorset. But the sculpture itself is made from clay, straw, clay and straw that she sourced around Durdle Door, which has then had mycelium, which is the root structure of fungus, grown through it. And you can see at the top of the sculpture there, perhaps, that some fungus have popped out the top. This has then been fired to kind of give it this final form. She produced a series of 6 works as part of the degree show. So it's quite a different, perhaps, take on sculpture to the works. Or I think actually it continues that tradition from Mason, but obviously it comes from a very different source. We have a couple of works that were actually commissioned by British Gas. So part of our campus, what's now the Science and Enterprise Park, was initially built by British Gas, who started their research centre there in the early 90s, and after about 12 years sold the land and the buildings back to the university. So this is The Flame by Neil and Oriel Lawson Baker, which is obviously inspired by the flame of a gas boiler and is very reminiscent of the logo of the then newly privatised British Gas. So quite a different way of commissioning public art that I think speaks to quite a different historical moment to the Stuart Mason works, kind of moment of privatisation and corporations. So it's still public art, but quite a different kind of political moment that it comes from and speaks to, I think. We're still, work still continues to be commissioned and installed on campus. This is one of the most recent works, which is called Dusiadu, which translates as every town. It's by the Ghanaian sculptor Atta Kwame, who sadly passed away in 2021. It's one of the last works he made before his death. He spent a significant portion of the latter years of his life in Loughborough. And this work was commissioned for the Folkestone Triennial, not biennial. And following its installation in Folkestone, we were offered the chance to install it on campus for a period, which we're really, really delighted to accept. So this is in Shirley Pierce Square on the east side of campus. And there's another work, Gateway to the Sea, which is very close to it. There are also works by current and former staff, chief among them 6 large-scale steel sculptures by Paul Wager, whose Revolution you can see here. So there's quite a wide variety of works, different scales, indoor and outdoor work, although the majority is outdoor, different materials that speak to quite different historical moments. So the collection is interesting because I think you can use it to tell this history of the university and a broader history about public sculpture, what it is, what it does. But I'm also interested in the kinds of imaginations that this sculpture can spark and that kind of stem from this sculpture. So still a history in a sense, but perhaps a less official history, and a form of history as imagination or imagination as history. And in 2011, the poet and writer Wayne Burroughs visited Loughborough, and he spoke about this sculpture. Excuse me. Willie Sukop's The Spirit of Adventure, and he described it as having the appearance of an artifact from a lost civilization, part of a modest civic vision of the future whose potential has passed, perhaps only temporarily, into a history that appears more remote than it actually is. So although he's tying this into a history, he's doing something else here. He's thinking about the imagination, this future that never arrived. The sculpture is transporting him, although it's part of the everyday, it's part of the kind of the environment of campus, it's transporting him into another world, a world in which a different future is enacted, and that sort of perhaps quasi-utopian moment of the post-war and the Stuart Mason's vision was enacted on a larger scale. And part of my background academically before I moved into this job was in utopian studies, where obviously science fiction and literature plays a big role. So when I was thinking about this, and when I think about the sculpture we have in general across the campus, 2 kinds of methods that are often used in literary theory when reading science fiction texts or utopias really inform how I think about the sculpture. And they're kind of opposites. One is estrangement, and estrangement is the way that a science fiction text takes you outside the everyday. So the book or the film or whatever it is has new rules, new ways of being, maybe it's a planet with different gravity, and you have to learn these as you go. So your habits about how the world works are undone, and you come to question how the world works, and you think how the world could be different. And for me, some of our sculpture does that. It stops you. It makes you think of a different world. It takes you out of the everyday and suggests something different. And that different we might think about through this other method, which is called the education of desire, which comes from the Marxist historian E.P. Thompson talking about William Morris and William Morris's utopian writings. And he suggested that Morris teaches us how to desire differently and desire better. And again, I think there's something about that in some of our sculpture. It opens up desire. It makes us think about how the world could be done differently, and perhaps just tentatively suggests what that might be. And I think hopefully some of that speaks to what both Richard and NEUSCHLOSS will speak to in their presentations and their contributions. I know science fiction and role-playing play a big role in influencing NEUSCHLOSS. And for Richard, certainly my reading of Our Tower is that this is very much about encouraging an expansion of the child's imagination, about getting the child to engage with their environment and desiring differently and desiring better or desiring more, perhaps. So this event isn't about a definitive kind of pinning down of what the sculptural imagination is or might be, but rather opening up what it could be and the kinds of imaginations that public sculpture, including some of the sculptures we have at Loughborough, might open up, educating our desire and perhaps estranging us a little from the everyday. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to do a little bit of admin while I switch screen sharing over to Richard in a second. But before that, I'll just introduce Richard. So Richard Johnson, who, as I've said, is the illustrator of Our Tower, is a university teacher and doctoral researcher in graphic communication and illustration in the School of Design and Creative Arts at Loughborough. He specialises in narrative illustration with an emphasis on children's book and sequential imagery, animation, storyboarding, and character design. And Our Tower is one of 55 publications, or over 55, in fact, it says here, that he's illustrated. He's a particular interest in wordless picture books, and his wordless picture book, Once Upon a Snowstorm, was shortlisted for the World Illustration Awards in 2018. So I'm absolutely delighted that Richard's here to join us. I'm going to make him a host so he can share his screen and hand over. So all yours, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that. Very interesting. Thanks for the invite to the event as well. I'm very pleased to be here. Yes, I mean, you've introduced me quite well there. It saved me a lot of work as well. So, yeah, I don't know how many publications I've done now with children. I think it's up to maybe 70, 80, something like that. I've kind of lost count. I've been a children's book illustrator predominantly now for perhaps maybe 23 years. I'm still a practicing illustrator. I've worked in all different sorts of forms of illustration, from advertising, editorial design, newspapers, and children's books. Now, I don't really know an awful lot about sculpture, I must admit. I haven't trained in sculpture officially, trained as an illustrator, but I'm very much influenced by sculpture and by environments and the sense of a story that sculpture can kind of bring as well to an environment. And I think today what I'm going to do is, if I start to share my screen in a moment, I'm going to talk about my work with Joseph Coelho, who is the Children's Laureate, and the book we produced, which came out last year, which is called Our Tower, which is this book here. So I'm also going to do a reading from Joseph's poetry book, which is called Overheard in a Tower Block. And that's where I first came to know Joseph, really, in his work. Now, his poetry is very autobiographical, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Joseph in a little bit, and a bit of his backstory, a bit of his history as well, where he kind of grew up. So let me share my screen, and then let's see if we can get this working. Now I've got two screens going on, so let's see if we can kind of make sure it's working. Now, hopefully you'll be able to see my full screen. Okay.
Yeah.
You can see that.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, David. Yes, so I'm going to really predominantly talk about Our Tower today, and really the influence that Lynn Chadwick's The Watchers had on Our Tower, which you can see here is one of the double-page spreads from the book, and I'll come back to this in a moment. As David said, I'm very much interested in sequential illustration. I'm obviously a university teacher at Loughborough on the graphic communication illustration course. I've been teaching there for a number of years now. I was also a student there actually in 1995, 96, I'm an undergraduate. So that was a fair while ago. So very much interested in how illustration works, how sequential storytelling works. But before I begin to kind of talk about my work with Joseph on the book, I just thought I'd just run you through very quickly some of my work and what I do, some of my process as well. So I'm an illustrator. I work in mixed medium, really, lots of different ways of working. I always kind of think, actually, I try and mix it up the way I work, just to kind of keep it exciting for me. Actually, I kind of found that out a few years ago. The more I kind of do, the more excited I get in terms of trying different things, different approaches. But predominantly, I use digital drawing using a tablet, and also kind of drawing on location as well. Drawing from imagination, and getting reference drawing as well. So here's just some examples of my work. As I say, I've been working for 23 years as an illustrator and designer, mainly kind of within the area of children's book illustration, storytelling, narrative design, but also in the areas of kind of editorial design, conceptual illustration. Some of this is kind of more conceptually based illustration. This was a symposium with Yeshiva University about the exchange between the Olympics between the UK and Japan. The central picture there is about migration, the bird. That's also with Worcester University, a book of kind of postcards around this idea of kind of migration and birds. Some more personal work here. Posters kind of for the underground there, that was the night bus on the left. The image on the right there kind of is again about migration, and you can tell my interest in kind of sequential illustration and layering of kind of panels and frames as well, which is kind of actually what my PhD is based around. And of course, children's book illustration as well. And you can really see, you know, some of my real interests here are kind of with telling stories, atmosphere, building a sense of atmosphere and character and place. This is, of course, for Wind in the Willows, which I did a few years ago now. And also, as David mentioned, one of my wordless picture books, which I wrote myself, which is called Once Upon a Snowstorm. Now, as I said, I do a number of different kind of approaches when I'm creating my work, from drawing on location. These are some watercolor drawings I did in my sketchbook. I think the one on the right is in the Cotswolds, and the one on the left was in Northumbria, actually. It's called the Bathing House, actually. It's where we stayed, which was quite nice. And also, as I said, drawing from imagination. This is kind of some of my kind of process here around kind of ideation, thumbnailing ideas, drawing from imagination compositions. And this is really a blend there of my process from, I quite often draw with traditional materials, paints, pencils, scan these in, and then manipulate them through Photoshop, through digital means. And this is a project here I worked on with Katie Belling, which was called Birdsong. Now, if I move on, that's a little bit of an introduction about me and my work. Just now talking to you about Joseph Coelho and the Watchers. Now, I knew of Joseph's work through Overhead in a Tower Block, which is a book of poems that he kind of released, I think it's about 2017, before he became a Children's Laureate. Now, Joseph grew up in Roehampton, which is near Richmond Park, in a tower block estate called Binley House. And these poems, this collection of poems in Overhead in a Tower Block, are all about his kind of upbringing in Binley House. And I'd read this book, actually, and very much enjoyed it. And one of the poems kind of stood out to me at the time, and I would like to read that to you now. It's a short poem, so it shouldn't take too long, but it's called The Watchers. The children felt the eyes burning down into their backs. They turned and saw 3 statues down by the cross tracks. Their legs were thin and sharp, their heads were bronze blocks. The children grasped their courage, took aim with dirt and rocks. Stones clanged off the metal, mud sucked the faceless grins. The children kept up their assault, then heard a malefic din. A droning from the statues, a blade scrapes teeth in jaw, a sound so full of hatred that the children dropped down to the floor. They quivered as the snow fell on this bone October night. The statues gawped sightless as the moon began to bright. The children's knees were knocking, tears juggling from their eyes. The statues kept up their stare, eager for their prize. One child ventured nearer, though fear told her to flee. The statues' gaze deepened. each peered more hungrily. She ventured a hand to feel the bronze-black shining skin. The statue tensed to the touch. The girl felt her finger sting. A smudge of red barely visible amongst the metal and the mud. The children fled screaming. The girl sucked at the blood. The statues on the cross tracks had hoped the children would linger. They rippled as they savoured the taste of that girl's finger. The statues are always watching from the tracks upon the hill. They sing for flesh and blood. They're out there singing still. So that was a poem by Joseph called The Watchers, which I kind of knew before we even kind of knew one another actually and started working together. And of course, when I actually started to speak to Joseph, when we got placed together by the publisher to kind of work on Our Tower together, we met online because it was in lockdown at the time. The team met together, and behind Joseph was a picture. He had a photograph up on his wall in his studio of Lynn Chadwick's The Watchers. And of course, we got talking about it because by coincidence, I knew the poem that he'd written about the Watchers. What I didn't know is that the sculptures were very close to him in Bingley House, where he grew up near Roehampton. So obviously, you know, the poem he wrote was, he used to play around these statues, these strange sorts of monolithic creatures. He kind of, you know, where he kind of grew up. And of course, by coincidence, Loughborough campus also has, I believe, the only other set of statues by Lynn Chadwick as well. So this kind of, this was a talking point for us and kind of drew us closer. We chatted about the kind of the sculpture and his experience of the sculpture, my experience of the sculpture as well. And actually, as we began to work on Our Tower, they became very significant in actually how we began to develop the text and the book. So I've just gone to kind of actually the making of Our Tower now, just to kind of show you how that happened. So obviously, as an illustrator, I often just get the text given to me. In this case, it was kind of Joseph's semi-poetic vision of Our Tower, which is actually a story about a group of children, we're not quite sure who the children are, who actually kind of go on this voyage of discovery from a place where they grew up, which is an inner city place, which, as you can see here, he talks about bags of rubbish, doormats, satellite dishes, dogs barking. It's a very kind of distressed, dark place. The children are not particularly happy living in this place, and they go onto this journey into much more kind of rural imagination, actually. And that was based on Joseph's, he used to play in Richmond Park, which was very close to Bingley House. So even Our Tower had a semi-autobiographical kind of nature to it. So as you can see, as I was reading that poem there, some of these images that I showed you were actually the visual research that I began to do around Bingley House, talking to Joseph, using some of his photographs as well, to really get a sense of actually kind of a sense of that place and a sense of those kind of statues in that place as well, actually. And my process really, as we began to kind of talk, is, as I say, about ideation, kind of thumbnailing, drawing from some of those photographs and getting a sense of the place. And the Watchers, those three statues, really became symbolic, actually, of the children. We decided to kind of create three children, the Watchers. These were almost kind of like the heroes of the story, the guardians of the story, the children that go on the adventure. And actually, as well as kind of representing these three children, the statues ultimately started to represent the change in how the children see their environment and imagine their environment. So you can see how some of the roughs developed from very quick thumbnail ideas into much more kind of finished roughs that we use to kind of really as the blueprint for the final artwork. And you can see here how this idea of the Watchers at the beginning of the story, they're kind of based on the Watchers. It's very dark, symbolic of kind of this very kind of urban, almost scary kind of environment. And actually, as the children go through this journey of discovery, they go on this journey of imagination really into the underground. As they return, they bring the magic back with them. which sort of reinvents the place that they live, and they start to see this place very differently. And again, the watchers became symbolic of that. They almost change at this point. The children are no longer scared of the statues, or they're no longer imposing. They're actually almost being used together, as they're almost playing together. So that almost became actually symbolic of, as I say, the change in how the children kind of imagined their world. And you can see how I've kind of developed from some of those drawings into the finished artwork that we see in the book. From the watchers here at the beginning, moving into the kind of end here, and we can kind of see this idea of the change I was talking about. Now, just finally, just show you a few of the kind of finished images from the book. Now, Joseph, as we were working on this book together, became the Children's Laureate, the 12th Children's Laureate, which was fantastic, but also a little bit of pressure for the book. This was his first book as Children's Laureate as well that we worked on. So thankfully, it's done quite well. I've been nominated for a Carnegie Award for the book as well, which is quite nice. But you can really see here, it's a real kind of journey of kind of discovery and imagination from what is a very almost celebrating the communities as well. And obviously, as I say, we were in lockdown at the time, and you can see my use of kind of paneling and boxes. That was also kind of symbolic of, as we are now, kind of in boxes. You know, everyone's kind of behind the screens, kind of in their own houses.
Oh, I'm getting dressed.
And the end of the book was much more of a celebration of the culture and the people within the cities, which were absent at the beginning, but actually all came together and kind of, you know, rejuvenated, celebrated the cultures of the city. So just finally, this is just an exhibition that we put together for the launch of the book as well. And this obviously ties in with my PhD around kind of unbinding children's books, creating kind of wordless stories and multilinear kind of reading experiences. And there's me and Joseph at the event there. Just kind of, actually, we finally got to meet in person, finally got to kind of, you know, give each other a pat on the back. And actually, you know, it was great to work with Joseph. You know, really interesting project to work on. Really wanted my work to really be representative of his upbringing, sort of his imagination as well. But I also kind of brought my own vision to the story. And I think all good kind of children's books do that. The text and the image do something slightly different, complement one another, and actually create this kind of new, this new kind of visual reading. So that's me really, and that's my kind of bit of an explanation on actually how the statues, the Lynn Chadwicks, the watchers, became really important to the development of our tower.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's yeah, wonderful, really rich and generative contribution, and really yeah, quite moving. It's a wonderful book. If you've got kids, I recommend it, and if you don't have kids, I recommend it.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. You know, everyone should own a copy, I think.
Absolutely.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. So, as I said, there'll be a chance for questions and comments at the end, and we can put your questions and comments to Richard then. But I'm going to move on now to introduce NEUSCHLOSS, or more specifically, Kate and Charlie from NEUSCHLOSS. So NEUSCHLOSS are a group of staff and postgraduate students in fine art at Loughborough University in Newcastle, who share an interest in collaborative and collective art making. And we've been working with them for a little while, quite well over a year now, on this activity pack, Cleaved Into, which they'll introduce more as the event goes on. So this is going to be a conversation between myself, Charlie, and Kate. So are you both, sorry, my Zoom's gone.
Yes, we're here.
Yeah, you're both there, brilliant, thank you. Fantastic. So I've just got a few questions which I'm going to use to structure the conversation. But it can be quite free-ranging, and I might ask some follow-up questions as well. So the first one, and Charlie, this one's for you. Really simple, but could you describe Cleaved Into in your words?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks, David, and thanks hugely, Richard. That was fantastic. I guess I think the best way to introduce Cleaved Into is to show it to you. So it's here, it's a box. It's an imaginative guide to the cited sculptures of the Loughborough campus. It's a creative engagement game that individuals and groups can be involved in and play. The gameplay is by way of prompts and scenarios. So that borrows ideas and game mechanics from RPG, that's role-playing games, and from wider board gaming as well. I guess its focus in terms of its prompts and gameplay is centered around creative writing, and possibly through that storytelling. And it's built around having a live experience with a number of the sculptures situated across the campus. So in terms of kind of opening the box, the size-wise, it's just under A5 in size. It's quite slim. The Cleaved Into is printed on the front of the box. Cleaved Into has become the title. And those are two words that were actually distilled through the process of the making. Those were distilled through a collective writing exercise by NEUSCHLOSS directly from Lynn Chadwick's The Watchers. So that happened both with The Watchers and then subsequently kind of from rethinking and a constant revisiting to The Watchers. On the back is a NEUSCHLOSS name print, and that's actually that's one of the first activities that NEUSCHLOSS undertook when they formed in around 2014. The design here is by Mark L. Khatib, and then opening it up, the first thing inside that we have is a pamphlet that says "Read this first." So that's useful there. And really, this just introduces the guide and the gameplay. It says that there's no correct way to engage with Cleaved Into or to play Cleaved Into. It's about entering a shared imaginative space around these curious objects. These curious objects being the sculptures and also the environments that they're in. So in addition, the next thing in the box is a set of prompt cards. There are nine of these. The faces of the cards, I guess size-wise, these are kind of like tarot cards in some way. All of them have individual watches on them, and those are transferred in a series of varied fantastical landscapes, which are actually illustrations by John Blanche for a 1980s fighting fantasy sorcery gamebook series. So those are borrowed from there. On the reverse of these cards are a series of prompts, titled prompts. So each one leads you into an imaginative connectivity with the sculptures. So just, I guess, it kind of to give you a flavor of those. This one here, descriptors, choosing one of the sculptures on the campus. Spend a few minutes writing a simple set of descriptors for this object. Think about its height, shape, weight, color, texture, material. Your word should give someone else enough information to be able to make a drawing. So that's not the full text there, but that's précis from there. And then another card here, dream. This gives another window into these prompts. Choose one of the sculptures on campus, close your eyes and imagine seeing it in another place. When you have this image in your mind, spend 20 minutes writing a description of what you see. So there's 9 of these prompt cards. There's actually 2 of them. The pack includes 2 blank cards for you to write your own prompts and gameplay. So those are key components. There's also the next thing in the box is a map. So this is a double-sided map. One side, so it can be laid flat or on a table surface. One side allows you to orientate around the campus and the sculptures, and the other side brings you to a remote other space here, which is a studio facility in Newcastle where a number of the prompts were developed and tested. So that's a double-sided map. Also in the box are two further booklets, scenarios, and this you can take with you to the sculptures. And this, and you can roll a dice. There's actually a rolling a dice sheet in the inside of the box here as well. So those dice rolls, however you're doing it, reveal one of 11 scenarios for each of the sculptures there. So these can be read on site with the sculptures, individually or collectively. And then the final booklet here, Narratives, which finishes the pack, brings a set of NEUSCHLOSS's own imaginative writings created through a set of these prompts centered around the sculptures. So really this is to read anywhere and kind of at leisure. So that's Cleaved Into.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to take this opportunity now. I'll remind people at the end if I remember. But if you're around Loughborough, join us on Wednesday afternoon. We're running leading a workshop where we're going to undertake some of those creative writing exercises. There are a few places left, so I've just popped a link, not many, but I've just popped a link in the chat. And if you would like a copy of Cleaved Into for free, sent to you in the post, or you can pick it up in Loughborough, drop me an email. I'll just put my email in the chat as well. I'll try to remember to remind people that at the end. But it's a wonderful pack. I'm really excited to get to work with it. Thank you, Charlie. That was a really lovely introduction. It covers a really unusual creative intervention with a sculpture really succinctly, I think. So thank you. Kate, the question that for you, and I guess for you, but for about NEUSCHLOSS generally, what is it that interests you about public sculpture? And obviously you and other members of NEUSCHLOSS have your own art practice, creative writing practices, lots of different media and kinds of practice that you have. So how does public sculpture relate to your broader interests and ways of working?
Thanks, David, and thanks for organising this event. It's been fantastic to hear about Richard's project. I think there's lots of interesting connections there. So yeah, as NEUSCHLOSS, as a group, we're interested really in the potential that exists for interacting with public sculpture, I guess, because it exists in everyday settings in the way that you introduced this event. Although obviously this collection has some inside-based sculptures, often public sculptures live outside. They're often in settings that are maybe dislocated from their context in art. You know, they don't live alongside the kind of text-based interpretation that you usually have in galleries. So in this way, they have, I guess, a potential to operate both on the banal level of street furniture sometimes, and also to propose speculative worlds by presenting as unexpected, sometimes fantastical forms within these shared outdoor environments. So I guess for us, it's this kind of hybrid presence in the world that we're interested in, and the way this might invite interaction. So one way we're interested in this context is how public sculptures take on meanings that might be collectively authored or re-authored, sometimes through affectionate or maybe unaffectionate renaming. So within this project, we adopted some pet names for the sculptures. So for us, Geoffrey Clark's Battersea 1 became the gun. Brian Neal's standing figure simply took on the artist's name. It became Brian Neal. And the same sculpture we read actually through your notes has been nicknamed Fred previously by students soon after it was installed in the 1960s. And in David's notes for the sculpture trail, he describes how it acquires sainthood and was celebrated in an annual St. Fred's Day by the Royce Hall alumni, well, the students who are living in that halls.
Which they still have, by the way,
right?
every year. Yeah. I went in their dining room the other day, and they've got a huge sheet of paper, which I think which just said St. Fred's Day 2021 on it, and all the students had written this like a message on it.
That's great to know. I wasn't sure if this was a kind of quaint 1960s kind of student activity, but that's amazing that it still goes on. But I guess, yeah, we're also interested in the kind of everyday significance that these public sculptures has as like meeting points or way markers for navigating the campus. We certainly used them in that way as we were introducing ourselves to the campus and to the collection. So in this context, which is bound by the campus, where the collection is located largely amongst buildings used by students of non-art subjects. The art department is obviously in this other part of the campus, across that main road. We're kind of interested in the way that these sculptures, as well as the art history that they come with, have gathered like hearsay, anecdotes and stories which are partial, perhaps because of that 3-year cycle of the students who pass through and interact with them. And there is the rumour that you shared with us, David, at the start of this project of about the metal ring, which since the 1980s has been missing from the hands of Peter Perry's Spirit of Technology, this leaning figurative sculpture that was formerly attached to the outside wall of Rutherford Hall. And David shared a Facebook group comment thread of Rutherford Hall alumni, in which somebody is accused by a friend of his daughter of being the culprit of this disappearance. So this hasn't resulted in the ring being found. It's never been tracked down. But reading these comments, it does reveal that the sculpture was also known as the Rutherford Man, and that it was regularly adorned with knickers and traffic cones. So that's kind of interesting to uncover. And it's examples like this which reveal a kind of speculative life of the sculptures, which feels exciting to us, I guess, partly because of the way we work as a collective, collaborative group, thinking about what it means to share an imaginative space. And partly also, I think, because it speaks of a kind of attitude to the more official narratives that exist around art, and specifically in this case around public sculpture. I'm going to hand back over to Charlie for the kind of unpacking of these broader interests. But it's worth noting that we often, as a group, work within and in response to institutions, and quite often university contexts. And I think we do this with a particular attitude, which I would describe broadly as playfully critical and resistant to academic conventions of research and knowledge production. So yeah, as you introduced us, we kind of describe ourselves as a coalition of staff and researchers based at Northumbria University, and not as a formal research group. And I think we approach this project approaching the sculptures as kind of curious non-experts.
Brilliant, thanks, Kate. And yeah, I guess connecting or thinking again, David, about your question there about kind of interest around public sculpture and broader interests and ways of working, then I guess at an early stage of the project, we really look to think about, conceive these artworks, the sculptures, as characters. That was something that's maybe something useful to pull out here. I guess characters, or at least kind of we asked what they could be or might be as characters. NEUSCHLOSS, as Kate said there, and as we know, is a collective group. And in that sense, the sculptures, the cited sculptures, are also a collective. So I guess thinking across those allowed us to see and think and address pluralities. Each sculpture, as Kate's also talked about, kind of having many stories, many voices, many attitudes. And that allowed us to bring our collective range. So I guess that's a question that we're constantly asking ourselves, what our collective kind of gathering is, what our range is. So in terms of histories, interests, curiosities, ways of working. So it's really about bringing all of those things to a sculptural kind of imagining through the collection. I guess there's other things here. There's a kind of a mobilizing force which maybe has come out of or connects to previous NEUSCHLOSS projects. So there's a project Das Traumen, which is titles The Dream. That's an event that NEUSCHLOSS staged in 2015 inside the brain, a sprawling artwork, the brain of Jason Rhodes, and it's an artwork he produced in 1998, and in 2015 it was shortly after his death. Actually, it was shown at Baltic, and we were involved and staged an event inside this brain. The title of the work is the Creation Myth. It's a schematic, kind of a total installation schematic of his brain, and he used to. It has fax machines and all sorts of things, which I guess technologically kind of date it as well. But while he was alive, he used to fax in to his brain when it was shown, other kind of things. Anyway, as part of that event, we were interested in remote viewing. So about another kind of access, a kind of a remote access there. And in a way that became quite a primary part of the work's thinking and its documentation as well. So the documentation for the event situates through a kind of a collation of documents leading into the event, and then the reports and the drawings through the remote viewing. So I guess these are sort of ways maybe of connecting to things that we're involved in, thinking around kind of parallel time, dislocated sites, and sensing experience. So in that sense, the Das Traumen, there was a mind-centered experience. So I guess kind of imaginings, myth, and magic are kind of ingredients very much for NEUSCHLOSS. We also worked, and this was shortly after his death in 2015, with an artist, David Dye, with elements of his work. And David actually taught for many years at Northumbria University, where Kate and I are located. So with David's work, we worked a number of iterations with one of his last works, actually, a piece that David called Tattoo, that David remade. It was interesting because it was a piece that David remade from 1987 that he completed. He made for his master's degree at Chelsea School of Art. So I guess our approaches were picking up around that, and we're also further kind of transformations and extensions of this already remade work, and I guess kind of looking to bring it into a space that allowed it to be alive, I guess for us, for audiences, for David. So bringing it really into sort of new alliances and conversations, and I guess those things kind of seem to chime here. And I guess kind of as we developed Cleaved Into, we were very much asking kind of sensory as well as political questions around the kind of the voice, this idea of character, what that representation and attitude was. And I guess these are the things that we harnessed ultimately. These were questions that then became the exercises. And I guess those exercises are kind of focused on bringing us into further connection with the sculptures, particularly when we were sort of geographically dislocated from them, so working remotely. So we certainly connected with the situational openness of the sculptures as publicly sort of encountered works within the campus. And I guess, yeah, we also very much focused on an idea of our strangeness as strangers to the sculptures. So I guess the exercises are sort of attempts towards an exchange, and those seem to sort of translated and become the pathways, the invitations, the prompts, the scenarios of Cleaved Into.
Thanks so much, both. Wow, yeah, my mind's buzzing. So I'm going to move on to get back to Cleaved Into. And Kate, I was going to ask you not so much what Cleaved Into is, but invite you to say a little bit about the process of making it as a collective. How?
Yeah, I'll try and be succinct, because as you say, we have been working on this project from really, well, 2020, we originally made a proposal to LU Arts. It's changed a lot since then, so I'll kind of pick up from 2021. I think we kind of started working on it in this trajectory. So we generated writing around the sculptures over the course of about a year, following a research trip that we did in the summer of 2021, when Nick and David from LU Arts gave us a tour of the collection. And on that trip, we also began doing writing experiments on site, giving each other tasks to do, and really kind of using that as a time of generating writing. Following that trip, across that year of writing, we thought about games and gameplay as potential ways to activate these sighted sculptures. So we improvised in response to prompts that we gave each other, and we worked on top of and into one another's writing on using Google Docs. In April last year, most of the group, not me because I had just had a baby, led a workshop on campus in which we invited those participating to kind of join us in this creative process of writing with the sculptures, guided by some of the prompts that we had used throughout that year. And the workshop began at the Watchers, where we collectively read a text. And that text had begun life as a collection of flat descriptions of just transcriptions almost of the Watchers, which we wrote standing in front of them on that first research trip. Subsequently, we had each separately reduced the entire text by half by graying out words, by redacting them, until only 39 remained. I'll pick up on this in a moment, but just to say that after we had completed this reduction task, we saw that the only two words that all of us had left in the text, so every member of the group, were these words cleaved into, so they seemed significant. This reading task, which began the workshop in 2022, was for the group, so NEUSCHLOSS and participants, to read this redacted text by tracing the grayed out sections internally, so silently, and then sounding out the remaining words out loud. And this acted as a kind of initiation to the workshop, a way of kind of collectively marking a shift from the everyday to a shared imaginative event, and one which began, I guess, with everybody in the group having to listen, to tune into one another, and to hear everybody's voice, for everyone to speak. So in this way, this kind of Watchers cleaved into text as a reading became a kind of mantra, a focusing exercise, and an invitation to participate. So we chose this cleaved into phrase as the title for the activity pack that we ultimately produced, and that was drawing from this text because it had been significant to the workshop, but also because we had obviously all been drawn to this phrase enough to leave it in the redacted text. And we kind of, as we discussed it, enjoyed the fact that there's a sense of duality to that word cleaved. You know, you can cleave apart or you can cleave to. The wording actually came from a description of a deep cut that is cleaved into the form of the central watcher in that trio of sculptures. There's a macho energy to this kind of, this word, this idea of splitting apart, and that felt fitting to many of the sculptures in the collection, particularly a lot of these post-war sculptures that I think we had gravitated towards. But it also describes this kind of powerful sense of converging. So, and I think for me anyway, I kept thinking of this phrase that one of my midwives had used to describe what happens to a placenta after the baby is born, that it cleaves away from and back onto the uterus walls repeatedly and before it finally comes away. So that was another kind of image that I had, at least. So it's this experience and the format of this workshop, as well as the gaming methods that we had used throughout the process, as well as discussions actually with Mark Al-Khatib, who designed the pack, which ultimately led us to produce an activity pack from our research. We have included our own writing in the pack, as Charlie said, those narratives the booklet that exists at the back of the pack, but we included these as examples because it's actually the prompts as a kind of playable experience that we wanted to foreground. It felt important to us that the work remains live, that it can generate different outcomes as different people play through it, and that it now exists in the world without us as kind of gatekeepers or games masters. And obviously for that, we're very excited that David's going to be leading this workshop on Wednesday, and this is the beginning, I guess, of its life, and people might be ordering this pack after today. So yeah, we're really excited that it lives in the world now. And as a final note, I wanted to refer again to the prompt cards that Charlie talked us through at the start, and I've been sitting amongst them for this talk. So these cards, which have the prompts on one side, have drawings of the watchers on the reverse, placed in these fantasy landscapes. And within the instruction booklet, the Read This First booklet, which introduces players to the pack, we included a footnote, which I thought I could read to you now, because I think it describes our thinking behind that placement, why we've placed the watchers in these landscapes, but it also kind of neatly sums up our approach to this project. So that footnote says, these strange landscapes are taken from illustrations by John Blanche for Steve Jackson's Sorcery series of fighting fantasy game books from the 1980s. Such books and authors are part of the role-playing and gaming context which has informed our project. To produce the original illustrations, John Blanche drew from the fairy tale illustrator Henry Justice Ford from the 1890s. We hope our appropriation is in the ongoing spirit of such intergenerational creative collaboration.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both. Oh, lovely. So we'll have a quick break, just a couple of minutes, just for people to step away from the screen, refresh themselves, and then we'll go into an audience, questions and comments from the audience. If you want to use that break to type comments or questions into the chat box, please do. As I've said, I'll also, when we come back, if you have a question you would rather speak verbally, you can just pop your hand up on Zoom, and I will invite you to unmute, and you can turn your camera on if you wish. You don't have to, and say your question. If you do have a question, I appreciate one might come to mind late, but if you could either type it or put your hand up as soon as possible, just so I have a sense of how many there are, because I'm quite keen to make sure we finish as on time at 8 o'clock. So see you in a minute or two. Thanks ever so much. Okay, hi everybody. I'll just check we've got Richard, you're there, yep. Charles and Kate, are you both there?
Yes.
So as I said, if you've got questions, feel free to type them into the chat. If you want to send them just to me, I can read them out anonymously. If you want to speak them, just pop your hand up using the Zoom raise hand function, which you do by, he says, how do you raise your hand? If you can work out how to raise your hand, raise your hand. If you can't, you can just type in the chat, I would like to ask a question, and I'll come to you. No one ever wants to go first. So I have a very broad question, which I have two questions. I'll take this one first because I'm interested, Richard, your perspective as someone who's interested in wordless narration, and I want to connect that to something you said, Kate, when in talking about what interests you about public sculpture, which is you said that it often exists without interpretation, and that's something that's interesting to you. And I am currently in the process of writing interpretation panels for our sculptures, and some now have them. And I'm wondering, am I spoiling the fun? Am I taking away, is that fixing the meaning of these works? Is that kind of limiting what can be done with them? Does it shut down the sculptural imagination and impose this kind of official history? And Richard, yeah, I guess your perspective as someone, sculpture is a primarily, but not exclusively kind of aesthetically visual medium, whether the addition of text, does it shut down where that can go? Yeah,
I think that's an interesting question. I think with wordless text, is there any wordless visual narratives? Is there anything truly that's wordless? Most things actually have some sort of paratextual information, whether that's a title, whether that's a name, whether that's actually, some indication of kind of how you might read or interpret the work. I mean, for a children's book, there is the synopsis, there's the kind of that material that surrounds a children's book, which kind of indicates some of the reading of that work. But I think, and I think you could apply that, as you say, to kind of sculpture as much as you can, kind of visual narratives, wordless visual narratives. I think, wordless visual narratives are becoming very popular in schools, simply because they can be interpreted in different ways. But of course, children need a dialogic reading. They need some prompts. So, David, I think it's the kind of prompts you ask to kind of fire the imagination. And there is, as the other guys say, there is no right way of reading or interpreting kind of this sort of work, really, I don't think. So that would be my kind of take on it, I think.
Thanks. Charles, Kate, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just what you're saying, David, about Richard, about this kind of, that there is always text around it, and there's always some kind of framing. And I think sometimes, I'm going to kind of undermine what I said earlier, but sometimes it can feel like the more generous thing to have no interpretation, but actually it can be breadcrumbs into a work. And we kept thinking about this idea of like encountering these without art knowledge. I think we were thinking about kind of putting ourselves in the position of like a student of a different subject who's kind of like, maybe you're studying sport or something, or sports science, and then you're kind of like, well, what is this thing that I have to walk past every day, and like what's this kind of interaction? And I think what's really lovely actually about the descriptions that you have on the Google the trail is that there is actually an interplay of like official narratives and anecdotes. Like it's these things are kind of placed alongside each other. So there's obviously there are ways of kind of inviting people into a work that doesn't always shut it down as a singular narrative. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, I guess that's I think it's super interesting. It's a great challenge to be thinking about in terms of those kind of texts and how those can structure in ways that allow for pluralities of reading or retain the spaces for that to happen. And I get it's interesting because we've talked a lot. I mean, I guess a part of our situation was visiting, revisiting, you know, these again, it's kind of, so it's encounters in a plural sense. And as Kate says, a lot of times we were thinking what that was for, you know, there's something great here in terms of the campus nature of the sculptures, in so much as they're part of a very personal landscape for the students and other people coming into contact. And as much as we kind of build habitual roots, those get shaken up. And so yeah, there's the kind of the encounters is really the sort of you know, opens a kind of an evolving, I guess, relationship and set of ways that these are sort of negotiated.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I'm pleased you picked up on that, Kate. And it's that when I write those panels, I really don't, you know, in a way, you know, the panels have the university logo on, so I work for LU Arts, which is part of the university's marketing team. So, you know, I am in a sense the voice of the university, but I want, you know, to try, and I want to tell the history of the university in a way, and why are these sculptures here, as well as the history of the sculpture, but to try to do it in a way that these different narratives kind of collide and don't produce a stable meaning. But obviously you can't avoid some sense of stability. And one thing I really like about Cleaved Into is like some of those official sounding texts have made their way in here, and like, you know, you're taking the mickey almost, and I mean, you know, like it's a playful kind of, you know, adoption of that form and twisting it into something new.
I think, David, maybe those are, you know, there's the other aspect that they're important as well. In a way, they become waymarkers. They give orientation points for the kind of the wider imagining. So I guess that's very much how NEUSCHLOSS kind of we were very grateful for those, and they gave us waymarkers to kind of work with.
I think there's just something to say about the sometimes it's useful that, you know, you're talking about writing as the institution or having that logo on there. I think there's something about writing as a collective, as NEUSCHLOSS, that sometimes gives you liberty to step into voices. That, I mean, we thought this might actually be a publication of creative writing at the beginning, and we were thinking about a polyvocal text. How can we include multiple voices, but that are under the collective authorship of NEUSCHLOSS? And, you know, we haven't allocated authorship of the different texts, but yeah, I think there's a kind of liberty there to kind of step into. It's quite fun to adopt like an official voice, and yeah, to maybe twist it or play with it.
Yeah. I've done some creative writing, collectively, and it's quite. I find it so liberating not to have your name attached to it. There's a question in the chat from Sarah. Thank you so much, Sarah. Which is what did the sculptor, what did the artist the original artist verbally say about the watches as a sculpture? So it's a sculpture by Lynn Chadwick, who was very well regarded. I guess after Moore and Hepworth, probably the most important British sculptor of the 20th century, so the late 20th century certainly. Produced a lot of works up until his death in the 90s, I think, maybe early 90s. And he was very famously grouped, along with a couple of other sculptors whose works we've got in our collection. Geoffrey Clark, a work we have by him. He was placed in this group by Herbert Reed, the anarchist art critic, who wrote for The Guardian, among other publications. He described a group of young post-war British sculptors as sculpting the geometry of fear. So he saw their sculptures, a lot of which were quite angular, quite masculine, I think, as being concerned with the kind of anxieties of modernism. So post-war anxieties, Cold War anxieties about sex. And Chadwick is really seen as kind of exemplary of that group, which also included Elizabeth Frink, who's also extremely well known. I think the watchers, that sense of this power watching over, you're not quite sure who's watching, where does their authority to watch come from. There's a kind of slightly dystopian suggestion there. Chadwick himself resisted that association, and really all he said was that his work, he said two things. One about his work in general, which was that he was really guided by the form. So when he was sculpting, I did read about Chadwick's methods, which were quite innovative and quite architectural, but I'm not a sculptor, and I've forgotten quite how he made the works, but they were quite unusual. So he said he was guided by the material he was working with. And about the watchers specifically, all he really said, to my knowledge, was that he was inspired by the Maui statues of Rapa Nui, which are often referred to as the Easter Island heads. So this kind of quite mythic power watching over us. So that was his kind of his take on the work. There's another nice story and a sort of a narrative about those sculptures, which is at Loughborough, which is a belief, or a sort of half-held belief, that they represent three sort of great men involved in the founding of the institution. So Herbert Schofield, who was the first principal of Loughborough College, Sir Robert Martin, I think, who was an early, I'm not quite sure what his role was, and William Brockington, who was the Director of Education in Leicestershire before Stuart Mason. And there is a belief that these three figures were sculpted to represent these three men, and that they're sort of benignly watching over this institution that they helped found, which isn't true, but it's a really nice story. And I don't want to be the person who goes around like squashing those stories in a way, because I think it's nice that they kind of persist, even though they're not true. Any other questions? So there's a comment from Amanda and then a question from Simon about how you chose the alien fantasy backgrounds that sit behind you, Kate, and are in Cleaved Into on the prompt cards.
I mean, I guess really it was about thinking of that idea of dislocation, and where else could these sculptures belong, and what kind of fantasy worlds they belong. I mean, it's I'd say the specific tabletop role-playing or the role-playing game book context isn't directly my knowledge that I brought to the group. There is the more specialist RPG knowledge by other members. So I don't know if there's anything more, Charlie, you want to add about the kind of the specific worlds that we place them in.
Yeah, I'm the same, Kate, and I guess the only other thing is it's maybe also thinking, or I guess I've got a sense it thinks into the sighted context as well. So kind of again sort of encountering not just the watchers but across the collection through the campus, and what that kind of experience is. So that kind of transposing into other realms, but again, these already exist within not unfamiliar sort of cited context to some of these kind of fantasy propositions, which kind of mix scenic and architectural elements and kind of other kind of formings of character. And I guess it kind of connects, or there's something there that talks back through some of the other thinking by way of the exercises and the prompts and the scenarios, and using or thinking kind of through the mechanics of RPG and other kind of board gaming sort of mechanics and devices. So the map on the reverse map, then there's a language which again comes from the RPG world, which is and the kind of the graphic, the visual language of it connects to that in terms of this kind of idea of dungeon crawling, kind of, which is then where the characters move through these environments. So there's a kind of, I guess it's a sort of a layered relationship.
Brilliant, thank you. couple of comments in the chat.
Actually, it makes the statues more attractive to me because I do find them brutally ugly, I have to say. And the big macho crack, surely the big crack's a big female crack, maybe. I don't know. If you're going to be cleaving, contradictory cleaving.
Or cleavage. I had in my head when I was trying to think of other connotations of cleaved. I was sure there's some kind of phrase about a baby being like cleaved to its mother, and whenever I tried to search babies and cleavage just came up. So I was like, oh yes, I forgot that was another connotation.
It is a contradictory, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'd like to join the game, but on a Wednesday afternoon I do Spanish. But if I can come to Loughborough for another day and get a go, because I'm in Leicester, and get a box, and then I'll definitely interrogate the statue myself.
Brilliant.
Okay.
I think that raises the question that I had sort of swirling around my mind, which is a big one, and for a whole other event or series of events. And it's about who's. So I think in both Richard's illustrations and the way that the sculptures kind of function as analogues almost for the children, but also as forms that spark the children's imagination, and the children are. I'll show you there. They are not all white males, and in your NEUSCHLOSS engagement, there's a real democratizing of the sculptural imagination, but nonetheless, that doesn't get away from the fact that most public sculpture is by white men. Most of the public sculpture at Loughborough University is by white men, and as you've pointed out, Kate, a lot of it is incredibly masculine in form. So I wanted to open that up to comment from the three of you about, is this something you've thought about, tried to address in your work, the kind of, the biases of the sculptural imagination, if you like, or the way it's limited or dictated by who makes sculpture?
I mean, I think there's definitely in that kind of approach of perhaps an irreverence to those official histories. I think that's kind of partly acknowledging that most of the sculptures are male authored and have a kind of macho quality to them. I'd say also there is a risk with RPG languages that also sits within maybe not macho, but a kind of like a masculine gendered, culturally gendered.
You'll have to tell me what RPG is. Sorry, RPG.
Oh, sorry. Role play games.
Oh, role play. Okay.
Yes. So there's tabletop role play games or game books. So they were a big influence on the activity pack. But it's so myself and another Leslie in NEUSCHLOSS. We don't have a background of having played a lot of these games. So in the way that we were kind of writing in some of these, the scenarios booklet that Charlie showed at the start, we were kind of approaching this as a creative writing task. So it's kind of, I think that it's useful that that we almost kind of undo some of the rules of that context as well, or some of the associations of that context. Or then there's a playfulness with the way that we've used some of that language and those conventions as well.
Yeah, I think the priorities are also kind of about bringing or allowing, giving access or permissions in terms of the invitations around what we've produced, and we're very much hoping that those those situate engagements with the sculptures around them in ways that are kind of forming of narratives which are implicitly kind of situated in very different spaces than the problematics that kind of embed historically.
I mean, my perspective, the way I responded to the watchers particularly, I mean, I don't, as I said, I don't really know much about the history of Lynn Chadwick or the Watchers, other than what, really what David's just told us tonight, really. The Easter Island Heads were a kind of influence that I'd kind of read. I mean, for me, they were almost a blank canvas. And I think that's what sculptures are, really. There's an intention, the artist has an intention with the work, but they are interpreted and built through their audience and rebuilt across time and space as well, which I think is really interesting. Everyone, as we've said tonight, everyone begins to have a story around a single kind of sculpture in a particular place. I mean, for me, the sculptures brought Joseph and I together across time and space as we're working on the project. But they were a blank canvas for us to really try and create this diversity of characters. These children, as David said, they're not all white children. It's important we kind of really tried to represent some of Joseph's background, actually, growing up in Roehampton, mixed race children, black children, white children. I think that was really important for me to really bring in the book, and trying to celebrate those diversities of culture as well. So yeah, I mean, for me, it was that they were a blank canvas for me to project, our imaginings onto.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Just to draw people's attention in the chat there, comment from Shulamit. In the Scriptural Book of Ruth, the original is translated as Ruth cleaves to Naomi. So another cleave for your cleaving list, Kate. I was just looking up, actually, so very close to the Watchers, there's another sculpture by Michael Dan Archer, which was commissioned in 1996, and that replaced a Ralph Brown sculpture that had been vandalized. And the Ralph Brown sculpture was called Father and Child. And a maquette for it still exists, so you can Google it. And it's a father lifting the child onto his shoulders. And there's another sculpture, which I believe is in Harlow by Ralph Brown, called Mother and Child, in which the child is seated on the mother's knee and the mother's breasts are exposed, represented sculpturally. So there's a real kind of, although in one sense I was like, oh, maybe that presents a less masculine vision of sculpture because the father's doing childcare. It's still a kind of, the dad does the fun stuff, lifting, and the mum's doing the sitting on the knee and presumably is just breastfed. So yeah, it's but with cleavage, a kind of interesting connection with what you were saying there, Kate. So if no one has any final questions or comments, I'd propose that we finish. Just give a second. Okay, it doesn't look like it. So thank you ever so much to everyone for coming this evening. To Charles, Kate and Richard for their generosity and their time and their brilliant expertise and discussion. To those who've asked questions, I just want to say thanks as well to Rachel and Simon from our marketing team, without whom you probably wouldn't have known this event was happening. To Nick, who's always been very supportive and really instigated this project, Nick Slater, our director. And thanks also to Loughborough University, who actually helped with some of the costs of Cleaved Into, so we're really grateful. Reminders, so I'll just post the links if you want to hang on for a couple of seconds. I'll post the links in the chat again for the workshop on Wednesday if you're around Loughborough, and my email address if you would like a copy of Cleaved Into. But other than that, thank you very much. Thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, David.